Sorry, now I'm on the BC Conservatives website and I just discovered they had their AGM last month in Kelowna and just adopted their policy of advocating for school choice in BC. A BC Conservative government will introduce a funding formula to provide equal per-student financing for students attending the same grade as in public schools for traditional, charter, and independent schools from K to 12. Note that we don't have traditional or charter schools in BC.
Well, I guess if the Conservatives are getting in, we will be.
Anyway.
British Columbia, I've seen your mountains high, seen your pretty rainbows and your blue crystal skies, watched your winding rivers as they flow around the bend. To me you're not a stranger, you'll always be a friend.
Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicos. Today is December 19th, 2018, and this is episode 117. Politicos is the BC Politics Podcast. Tell us what you think of the show by leaving us a review or get at us on social media. Most importantly, help us build the show by throwing us a couple bucks a month at patreon.com/politicoast.
Start the line boom.
And I'm Ian Bushfield. As always, you're listening to Beautiful British Columbia by Serge Plotnikov. On today's show, we have an interview with Green Party House Leader Sonia Furstenau, and we take a look at the George Massey Tunnel report that came out, and how we're kicking all the cans down the road. BC Today's on hiatus for the holiday season, so I won't give the normal plug, but do go check it out if that's the kind of thing you're into. And in the new year, you can get some great coverage of British Columbia politics. But let's go over to my interview with Sonia Furstenau that I recorded earlier this afternoon. Sonia Furstenau, House Leader for the BC Green Party and MLA for Cowichan Valley. Welcome to Politicoast.
I'm so happy to be here.
So before we get into some of what's happened over the last year and what's going on for the next year, this afternoon, the Legislative Assembly Management Committee met again. Could you maybe just give us a quick take on what happened today, if anything?
So today the agenda for the committee was really to look at the budget, which will be sent to Minister of Finance for inclusion in the estimates. And it's the budget of the Legislative Assembly. So it includes the caucus budgets, the constituency offices, the library, Hansard, the dining room, security, clerks, everybody that makes this place operate. Those are the budgets that we were looking at today. And, of course, overlaid on all of this is the ongoing police investigation that everybody learned about in November. And what essentially is a bit of a tightrope walk between those two things. And what was established at the last LAMC meeting was the financial statements from 2017-2018. They haven't been approved. The Auditor General isn't ready to sign off on them. And obviously, because there's an investigation, we don't know what that investigation is about, but there's a lot of questions in the air. So we haven't, as a committee, signed off on last year's audited or financial statements. However, that doesn't impede our capacity to approve a budget going forward and to keep basically the Legislative Assembly working.
And I take it the Liberals are still very hung up on this question around the activities of the Speaker's office.
They are, which is, what I think is important to note is that there is an active RCMP investigation, but it is not of the Speaker's office. It is. He is not under investigation by the RCMP, and so the focus on that, while it makes for interesting meetings and news coverage, is a bit of a distraction from the fact that there are some serious questions that we all want to have answered. But of course, at the same time, we don't want in any way to impede or undermine an RCMP investigation.
Absolutely, and we'll hopefully get more information in January when things may or may not come out. But let's turn our focus to the broader work of the Legislative Assembly over the last year. What, in your opinion, have been the top accomplishments for the BC Green Party in the session?
It's been an extraordinarily busy and full session, and one that I think we all feel quite proud of. Obviously, the Clean BC, the climate plan, is at the top of the list of accomplishments, and that was Andrew's file primarily, but it is something that is important to all of us and is a driving force for all of us, is to recognize that we really do have a moral imperative to act on climate and to recognize that in the crisis that we are in globally, there is also this opportunity not only to reshape our economy, to turn it into a low-carbon economy, but actually to improve our economy and to improve our communities and to make life better. And this is, I think, that was the focus of Andrew's efforts for a long time on climate action, is to recognize that this isn't about sacrifice. Acting on climate and acting on creating a future for future generations that is sustainable and healthy is actually a positive step full of opportunities. And not only is it required of us, but it gives us this opportunity to make things better. And so that was a huge accomplishment. And for me personally, the fruition of the professional governance legislation that came out this fall, that really was what, if there's a story for me of why I'm an MLA, it traces back to my time in Shawnigan, first as a teacher there and then as the area director, as where we as a community really came together to stand up for the future that we wanted in Shawnigan, and that future did not include a contaminated landfill at the headwaters of our watershed. And in the process of fighting that permit that was given by the previous government for a contaminated landfill for 5 million tons of soil, in the midst of that, we discovered this legislation at the center of what was unfolding in our community, and that was professional reliance. And this is early in the 2000s, under the Campbell government. There was this legislation in that essentially deregulated a lot of what happens around resource industry in BC. So instead of having experts within the government that would oversee applications and the technical aspects of those applications and enforcement, compliance, all those things, industry was given the task of hiring their own, what you would call qualified professionals, and then the qualified professionals would report to government, and government would accept what the professionals were saying. And fundamental in that, a lot of people would recognize a kind of foxes guarding the henhouse scenario, and a sort of fundamental conflict of interest where you're being paid by a company or by industry to report on their activities to government, and your paycheck depends on, the industry being happy to some degree with your report. So what happened in Shawnigan was it went one step further, where the engineers who had been tasked with a technical assessment of the landfill, a few years into this battle in our community, a document emerged that was a secret profit-sharing deal between the engineers and the landfill owners. And so as a community, we thought, of course, government is going to say that's not okay. You can't have the engineers having a profit share in a financial interest in the outcome of this if you're relying on their information for making the decision. And the information is supposed to be information that determines whether this is safe for the environment and the community. And what we discovered was, of course, that under professional reliance, that was an acceptable situation. And so when I started to think about if I wanted to run to be an MLA, it was this legislation that was really at the center of what I saw needed fixing in BC. And so in the spring, we had the report from Mark Haddock come out that identified significant issues with professional reliance and 121 recommendations. And the recommendations 1 and 2 were captured in the legislation, 93 pages of legislation that came out this fall, that begins to really address these structural challenges with professional reliance. So that's, for me, was a significant piece of legislation to see come to fruition, and I'd been working on that throughout our time here, and I really wanted that to be in our confidence and supply agreement. It was in our platform.
Yeah, thanks for walking through that. I think a lot of people have really missed that piece of legislation with all of the other more flashy and that's a very technical kind of change, and sort of 3 layers down, but it has real life consequences, as you're talking about, in your specific community.
And when you look at there was an identification of professional reliance being an issue in the Mount Polly disaster. There are communities around BC that have, in the Mark Haddock's report and in other reports, Auditor General's report as well, and the Ombudsman's report on professional reliance, that there were many, many cases around BC where impacts were experienced by communities. And so, I like your characterization. It's not flashy, but it is significant legislation. And then along with that, of course, the environmental assessment revitalization that brings in a climate test, that brings in the adoption of UNDRIP. It's the first piece of legislation that specifically adopts the principles of the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous People. So it was, for the sort of core green values of sustainability and a healthy economy as well as healthy society, this was a very big session.
Mm-hmm. I want to come back to Clean BC in a second, but just while we're on the professional reliance bit, you mentioned the 121 recommendations, and this legislation kind of ticks off the first two.
Mm-hmm.
Do we expect you to be pushing more on this file in the next year to sort of close off other loopholes or other issues you see?
Yep, absolutely. And so that will be ongoing work. Many of the recommendations can be dealt with at a ministry by ministry level, at a regulatory level. But so now there's this opportunity to recognize that there can be connections between a lot of pieces of legislation that came in. So you look at professional reliance and or professional governance, as well as the environmental assessment, and then you start to look at the Water Sustainability Act, and you start to see that there's a way of mapping out a future for the land base and resource use in BC that really can begin to be long-term thinking, and this is where I really want to focus my attentions going forward is back to the kind of overarching issues of watersheds in this province, and how do we start to work towards a future where we are making decisions at a watershed level, that we are recognizing that this is the fundamental kind of operating principle of any community, and how do we, with these kinds of pieces of legislation in place, it can start to inform an entirely different kind of decision making, and I think one that's much needed.
Well, part of a different kind of decision making, and you referenced it already, is UNDRIP and this approach to reconciliation, and this has been big in both the Green Party and the NDP's rhetoric and approach over the last year. John Horgan talked about earlier, I think it was last month, working with Indigenous nations to share gaming revenue, but also that he would be bringing in a big piece of legislation to incorporate UNDRIP across BC laws in the new year. Can you give us a sense maybe of how big that is?
Well, I mean,
if you know.
This is one of the things about, the position that we're in, is that if there's, and we agreed in our confidence and supply agreement that UNDRIP would be a guiding principle moving forward, and I think that we're seeing that starting to happen in government. In terms of a big government announcement, I don't have any secret special insights into that. However, I think that this is essential work for us in Canada and in BC. It is some of the most important work we can do, is really to recognize how are we going to address both the history of Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples and the future that we want to see it become. And I think that steps are being taken, strides are being taken, and we have a long ways to go. And it is central to how we are going to reshape so much of what we do in this province. And again, in a positive way. We tend to frame these things as, we're going to lose something. It's going to be a sacrifice. But I see it completely the opposite. We have so much to benefit from and so much to gain by really recognizing that an entirely different foundational relationship can be built in this province around First Nations and Indigenous peoples. And I think it's, along with the work on acting on climate change, these are the two fundamental pieces that need to happen.
Well, let's talk about the Clean BC plan and some of the surrounding issues. I know one thing the Greens have been very critical of the NDP government for is its approach to this LNG Canada project, where they say they're going to bring in this big liquid natural gas development in northern BC, one of the biggest developments ever in Canada. And the NDP says we need the jobs and the economic growth to support the province while we transition. Andrew Weaver's also been on the record in the last week saying he doesn't think it's going to be built. I assume you share Weaver's belief, but do you think there's a way to square this LNG project within our climate goals?
Yeah, well, number one, I think it made it more difficult to lay out how to achieve the targets that were legislated. So that's the one thing. You suddenly add all these emissions that weren't there, so everywhere else has to reduce their emissions. So that was, that adds a challenge. Number two, and I agree with Andrew on this, the transition isn't something that we look at in 20 or 30 years. I mean, you look at the IPCC report, it says we're down to 11 years to really make a significant reduction in our emissions if we want to stay below 2 degrees. And, the urgency hasn't been there. The political will has been lacking, not only here, but around the world. And it just seems to be one of those scenarios where you're in the cave and you don't react until the bear is in the cave with you. And then you go, uh-oh, what do I do now? There's a giant bear in the cave and my survival is at risk. And in this case, what we're saying is, we're not going to act. It's not necessarily our survival, but it's the survival of future generations. And so, it is definitely challenging that there is this notion of we can talk about the transition, we can talk about reducing our emissions at the same time as we talk about bringing in an LNG plant. And we've made it really clear to the NDP. So it was a final investment decision by LNG Canada. It wasn't the NDP doing anything in the fall. It was an announcement by LNG Canada of a final investment decision. What the NDP have committed to is bringing in a lot of tax breaks for the industry. And what we have made clear is we won't support that. And I also think, Andrew, there's been a lot of these kinds of big announcements about big projects, and oftentimes they don't go forward. And ultimately, the direction that we look at is how do we get the very best climate policy in place? How do we ensure that we are steering this province in a direction that does, make it possible for us to reach those emissions targets and make it possible for us to truly transition to a low carbon economy. But it is disappointing that the NDP have kind of picked up the baton from the BC Liberals on LNG. And when you look at the emissions from the methane alone, that is a significant problem.
On the big projects that are going forward, the other one that the Greens have been highly critical of course, is Site C. No one's really making the argument directly, at least in the political circles, that this is necessary to fulfill the electricity of the Clean BC plan and the electrification. But it seems to be helpful if we had that amount of electricity. Does this kind of put the Greens in a weird spot of they were against it and now maybe there's a value to it going forward?
No, the irony of that is that before the Site C announcement was made, there was a significant interest in private investment in creating electricity in BC. And I'll just cite one example. I met with the mayor and council of Tumbler Ridge at the 2017 UBCM conference in Vancouver. And they were so excited because they had a number of private investors lined up to bring in more wind energy. They already have the good wind energy coming out of Tumbler Ridge, but they had these private investors that could have produced 70% of the energy that Site C is going to produce just in Tumbler Ridge. And it was an agreement where there'd be private investment, but there'd be agreements with the municipality of Tumbler Ridge as well as the Indigenous nations for jobs and long-term kind of planning. And as soon as Site C was announced, those private investors pulled out. They didn't want to, you suddenly, you can't compete with that kind of mega project. And I think that this was one of the real tragedies of that announcement was that you lose the opportunity that was already presenting itself. And I think that and Andrew, again, this is one of his big files and one of the things he focuses on quite a bit, but we really need to reimagine how we can be producing electricity in this province that doesn't entail the destruction of valleys, but in fact strengthens local economies, looks at localizing our energy production, looks at BC Hydro as a transmitter of energy rather than a producer of energy. And so there's so much possibility, and Site C was an example of that lost possibility and lost opportunity, but it doesn't mean it's lost forever. I think we still have to be very innovative and willing to look at how can we do this better and do it differently.
All right, well, it's been 20 minutes, so I'll just finish with one forward-looking, optimistic question.
Sure.
What is on, and there's been some of this talk about a renegotiated confidence and supply agreement, whether that gets renegotiated or the Greens just sort of work with the NDP on the throne speech and budget. What is on your Christmas wish list for the province in the next session?
Well, I'll loop back to what really brought me here, and I've mentioned it earlier in the conversation, which is watersheds. And I think that the one area that really needs attention in this province is how we do forestry, how it impacts communities and watersheds and sustainability. I think that this is a huge area that has massive room for improvement. When you look at the old growth logging on Vancouver Island as an example, we are down to a very, very small amount of old growth forest left. And once it's gone forever. I mean, this is not replaceable. You can't replant old growth. And when you look at the kind of conflicts that rise up all over the province, and right now the Kootenays is an example where communities are getting more and more concerned about kind of industrial scale logging happening closer and closer to their communities and happening right in their drinking watersheds. We really need to reimagine a sustainable future for forestry and for communities and watersheds in this province. And it's possible, but we have to be, as you say, like forward-looking and optimistic and excited about the potential that we have here, but also very aware of where the policies that are in place right now are not working for forests, are not working for communities, and are not working for watersheds. And I think that this is where I really look forward to kind of diving in and devoting a lot of time to. And then the other piece for me, and this is a very Cowichan Valley related piece, stemming from the efforts that we see in our community, which is the work to reduce the number of Indigenous children that are taken into care in this province. And that is, as Jane Philpott has pointed out, the federal minister, it is a humanitarian crisis. And the impacts of that on families, on communities, generation after generation of people who have been affected by this practice of removing children from their families. This is very important work, and we are underway in it in our community, and really committed to seeing different outcomes and seeing more positive outcomes, and recognizing that, if we keep adhering to the same practices, and right now the level of removal is commensurate with the 60 scoop, for which the payments are starting to go out, right? So you're in the same cycle, you're doing the same actions, you can anticipate the same outcome. We need a radical reimagining of how this works, and again, this ties in with recognizing the inherent rights of Indigenous people to self-government, and so that's the other significant piece of work that I'll be doing in my constituency and down here.
All right, well, I hope you get some time and some rest over the holidays to get ready for all of that.
Thanks so much, Ian, and you too, and keep up the great work.
All right, have a good
Thank
holidays.
You. Bye.
Moving on to segment 2, kicking the cans down the tunnel. Earlier this week, the BC government released the consultant's report on the proposed replacement to the George Massey Tunnel. And as we kind of alluded to with our segment title, they've decided to, do a little more study and make a decision later.
This was great. I think in our Slack, people were trying to place bets whether we'll go for a bigger tunnel, like double it, or if we'll have a just smaller bridge. Everyone was wrong. No one predicted the consultation report will recommend more consultations. It's amazing. The Liberals drew a lot of heat from the Mayor's Council and the NDP for proposing this 10-lane bridge that I think one mayor in Delta was asking for.
Delta really liked it, and their new mayor and their council still really likes the bridge proposal.
But the NDP thought there were bigger priorities, like the Patello Bridge that is literally falling down, and other things around the Lower Mainland. So they cancelled that and commissioned this report, which says, at the very least, it tells us a 10-lane bridge was too much. So we know that now.
Well, I mean, it would get rid of all the traffic congestion, according to the report, until 2045. Like, literally, you would never have to wait there once. But that, probably isn't the best value for money, which is what the report found. And they looked at some of the other options, such as a 6-lane bridge or an 8-lane, like just an 8-lane, don't make any other improvements, that would do. And they would take up 87% and 91% respectively of the traffic volumes expected in 2045. So, it gets to be the point where you're asking, okay, why are we spending all this money so that, someone 30 years from now doesn't have a minor inconvenience, and maybe those capital expenditures are better spent closer to that time.
One of the interesting things about these projections is it's not actually going to grow substantially. When you look at the region as a whole, it seems like, at least in this report, most of the population growth isn't expected to go to Delta and that area, as it is instead going to Vancouver, Burnaby, Richmond, and all the places essentially on the other side of the tunnel or across different bridges, in which case the tunnel needs to be a bit bigger because it's clearly over capacity right now and people get frustrated all the time, and it's a bit old and needs retrofitting at least. But that doesn't beg for a massive replacement, but something more moderate and reasonable.
Yeah, so they are expecting traffic to grow somewhat, but not a huge amount. And they also flagged the issue that having no congestion on the bridge might actually conflict with some other long-term goals, such as mode shifts in transportation. They point out in the report that it doesn't make sense to say implement a congestion charge if there is no congestion, because you spend billions on billions of dollars building a mega bridge. So there's some things like that. They also, as mentioned, looked at the options for keeping or replacing the tunnel. So back in 2006, I believe it was, they did a bunch of retrofits, made the actual tunnel itself seismically up to code for that period, but they didn't do any of the work on the riverbed and the soil the tunnel's on. So liquefaction's a big concern still, and that would have to be addressed. And they figure it's probably going to be about $300 million just to bring that up to modern specs, and even that's probably not gonna, or might not be the full up to code, but more kind of where it was like 10 years ago in terms of codes.
So this is all, I guess, good news for the NDP and sort of justification for their decision to scrap the big bridge. It's frustrating for residents on both sides of the tunnel, and the Liberals were very quick to point out that the NDP are in no rush, apparently, to build a bridge between two Liberal ridings. That is an admittedly good talking point, or like amusing talking point.
It is a regional choke point, though. And like, it's not just the Liberals that get annoyed. I mean, I live in an NDP riding, and I get annoyed when I have to get stuck waiting to go through there on my way to the ferry. So like, there is more than just the ridings where the tunnel will literally be in, that this could potentially blow back on them if they delay it indefinitely. But at the same time, like this report wasn't great for the Liberals because it pulled out quite a few things where it looked like they kind of set the project scope in a way that kind of limited the options and ended up bringing the costs on it way more than it would need to be. For example, they had a requirement that the bridge couldn't have any part of it be in the river, which requires a much bigger, stronger bridge with more complicated structural design for the deck, and well, that would increase the cost. Same thing with the requirement that the bus lanes be in the middle of the bridge, which now
is a bizarre choice.
They had some rationales for it, but the end result in that is you're now spending $500 million to separate transit exchanges in the at each end of the bridge, and there wasn't necessarily a need to scope it that way that early on, and it really limited their options in the more expensive direction. So there's quite a few things the Liberals could have done better on at the earlier stages, and, maybe if they'd done that, we wouldn't necessarily be here right now.
Where we are is now with this report calling for more consultations, and I think the NDP has already said they're going to start doing those very early next year, and they do actually, it sounds like, want to get going with whatever option ends up getting decided.
Yeah, they said business case by 2020.
Yeah,
But
so another
there's-
year
yeah,
and a half.
Yeah, and there's a lot of stuff that still needs to be figured out. One of the recommendations, for example, was to look at building another tunnel beside it, which some previous studies had indicated may be the best route, but this project didn't really look at in significant detail. And they also flagged the fact that some of the concerns raised, when they were starting the bridge work was maybe not technically sound in terms of why you can't build a tunnel there. It turns out you can build a tunnel there. So, there's some work that, maybe should be rechecked on this, including maybe we can just build another immersed tube tunnel beside the current one.
In the meantime, people are still frustrated. I know I saw on Twitter that apparently the London Drugs headquarters based in Richmond, and they're thinking of actually moving out of Richmond because of this delay, because they're frustrated that I guess all their employees live south of the river. And
I guess so. You'd think if they were roughly evenly distributed in the metro area, that there'd be more north of there. But I don't know their specific employment patterns. But they did flag that as something and are talking about maybe moving as part of a result of this.
And I imagine other major businesses are having similar frustrations, and individuals like any of us who have to drive that tunnel. I've generally been lucky the last few times, mainly because I usually go down with my partner, so we're carpooling until we can cut in half a kilometer or less before the tunnel, and you feel pretty good about that. So do take the carpool lanes, pro tip. Otherwise, the big problem with this giant bridge, as I always saw it, is if you put that there, that traffic just ends up on the Oak Street Bridge, and maybe the Knight, but it still goes somewhere, and the Oak Street Bridge is kind of garbage as well. It's probably better for longer than the tunnel or the Patello, but
if you're not going to Richmond, the benefits of the previous project scope were a little limited in that sense. So I believe the improvements to the highway stop pretty much right before the Oak Street Bridge.
Yeah.
Even if you build the Oak Street Bridge bigger, you now just have Oak Street where that's the problem at the other side. You can't funnel 10 lanes of highway onto a city street grid and not have it back up.
Yeah. Hopefully we can use this as an opportunity to start shifting the conversation, find some moderate compromise solution that addresses the challenges that exist and also promotes better rideshare. I mean, the 10-lane bridge did include a lot of amenity. It was, the gold-plated. It included all the transit you could ever want because that's what you can do with 10 lanes.
Yeah, $500 million of transit stuff that TransLink said they didn't really need because
SkyTrain to Delta.
Even TransLink was like, you know what? We don't think Delta's ever getting a SkyTrain. Don't build a bridge for us for that. Do build one for our buses, but, not a SkyTrain.
So this report's getting kicked down the line.
So, it gets kicked down the line. The tunnel definitely needs upgrades. I think that is pretty uncontroversial at this point, although I'm sure a few hardcore anti-tar people would disagree, but...
Didn't I see recommendations they should at least, clean it more often? Wash it so that it stays cleaner so there are fewer crashes? I don't remember if that was in this report.
They are upgrading the lights.
Yes, improve the lights and wash the walls so that it doesn't...
Lights and ventilation are the big things they're doing there. But it definitely becomes then a bit of a political hot potato on the, now you're delaying this. And, I think once this comes back and it'll probably, assuming, just your general construction price escalation, which has been hurting the region pretty bad here, but assuming that isn't too bad, they're probably going to save, $1 to $2 billion by changing the scope a bit on this. I'm pretty sure they're going to axe the $500 million transit exchange because that's completely unnecessary and actually allow stuff to be built in the river too, which will save a bunch of money. It's just stuff like that if, you go back to the drawing board a bit and maybe question some of those initial assumptions, you'll actually get a much better value for it. In that sense, pushing it back a year isn't the worst, or even 2 isn't the worst idea.
So, well, that gets pushed back a year or 2. The other thing that's getting kicked down the road is the education funding review. And there's not a ton I think either of us have to say on this, but I know a lot of teachers, especially on the BCTF, have been really worried about this review that the NDP has been doing. So in BC, we have a funding model for our education system where the province says we give this many dollars per student, and that's how we fund our schools. If your school district gets more students, it gets more money. If it's declining, it loses money. This was set up in 2002, right after the Liberals came to power. And even if it was still the Liberals, it would probably be worth a review still, because funding models are the kind of thing where the assumptions change. The intro of the report highlights that when it was set up, most school districts were declining in enrollment. And that's the exact opposite of the case now. A lot are actually drastically increasing. And that really messes with how these systems work, because you're always like a year off. So the NDP tasked this, one of their many, many task force, to go do a review of this, consult with everyone, and come up with a bunch of recommendations. Now, I heard from a lot of teachers that they felt like not enough people were actually spoken to. I guess the review did talk to all the school districts, but maybe the union wasn't as consulted as they wanted.
Nobody is ever as consulted as they want to
Well,
be.
unless they win.
Yes.
But there are also BCTF contract negotiations coming up next year as well, so they were also very nervous that a giant change in the funding model could then affect what teachers get paid next year. The recommendations that came out really just kick it to another round of consultations. So they put out 22 recommendations, but they're mostly, let's talk to the stakeholders and see what they think. Key among them is like, things don't actually change that much. So rather than just having this a somewhat simplistic per student model, they will fund special needs students first and then distribute the rest of the money on a per student basis. Now, that's always been the issue with the per student funding model, is because schools or classrooms that have a lot of kids with special needs need more support. They might need an educational assistant and these other kinds of supports, and that costs more money. I think teachers were really worried the government was just going to kind of average how many special needs students were in each district and not really take into account all of the differences, because no 2 kids with special needs are the same. That's why they're special, the funny words. And so they're going to put the money out there and then per student fund it. But all of this will come into new consultation. So this funding will not go into effect in the budget in the spring, which I guess has relieved teachers' fears. I've heard Glenn Hansman, the head of the BCTF, going around saying this is a good step forward. And I think the other thing it might open the government up to, but I would be really surprised if they did, is actually looking at independent school funding, because the NDP's never been a big fan of that. But now that they're in government, have not said a word about it, and didn't really talk about it during the election either. I know the BC Greens are happy with the status quo and the Liberals would expand it. But any change to the funding model also affects the independent school funding, because that is just a proportion of what the public schools get. So if the public schools get more, private schools actually get more. I want to see it all gone, but that'll be a long, long campaign to fight. This will be something to watch through the next year, particularly with the negotiations with the BCTF. I don't think we've talked at all about all of the public sector contract negotiations that have happened this year, but they've all gone surprisingly well. And not like unions are getting gold-plated contracts, but everyone's getting like a 2-3% increase in salary and coming off fairly happy, which is shocking for contract negotiations, just regardless of the government, whether it's NDP or Liberal.
Yeah, we'll see how long that lasts.
The BCTF is infamous for being like the most vocal and good at getting their word out. So I don't know, maybe next year will be the end of the labor harmony we've had in this province for a while. But if this funding review announcement is anything to judge by, I think things might continue fairly smoothly. Everyone's trying to get along. And I think maybe no one wants to upset at least in the labor/government side, no one wants to upset things too much that it risks the government crashing and the Liberals coming back.
Yeah, and right now, as we've said so many times, the Greens don't have too much of an incentive to upset the apple cart, but they're not a party that's known for just wanting to throw large amounts of money at public sector unions, so, it can be a risk.
Moving on to quick takes, ICBC has released the desired amount they want to raise all your car insurance rates by, and it's only 6.3%. I say only because I think there was a lot of fear that it might break into the double-digit percentage increase, because everyone is still calling ICBC a dumpster fire. To put a number on that, they lost $1.3 billion last year and $890 million this year.
So it's still a dumpster fire, but the flames are just not quite as high.
Yeah, they're still coming over the like edge of the dumpster, but they're not like 10 feet in the air. They're only like 8 feet in the air. These still have to go through approval, and if they're approved, your rates will go up on April 1st. CBC says this would be an average increase of about $60 per year for a driver, which actually doesn't work out to that much. The problem is if you have a 6% increase every year, it goes out of control pretty quickly. David Eby is claiming that his changes that he's been slowly tinkering around with ICBC have brought the hike down from what would have otherwise been a 40% rate hike. That's his word. You know, I know and like David Eby, but I don't know how to judge that claim.
40 seems excessive.
Yeah.
Maybe someone were taking the numbers at way far one end of the scale, going with that one.
He has done a number of things to ICBC and sort of put caps on soft tissue damage claims and a number of other attempts. And they're looking at a number of pilot projects, including some that get a little like privacy violating feeling, like sensors in your car that tell if you accelerate or brake too hard. And if you do, you get an insurance penalty. Or maybe the opposite. If you don't, you get it.
Yeah,
there'll be an opt-in.
They were opt-in sort of things where, you know, if you're already a safe driver, you'd sign on to this program, and then there'd be some monitoring thing.
And I don't know how exactly I feel about it. I think it's an interesting approach, but I don't know. It's a very tough situation to solve.
Of course, the problem is that the people who should really be hit for doing that are probably the least likely people to actually sign up. You know, the people who gun it to 60, trying to be the third car on a change in yellow. That happens so often here in Vancouver.
Well, I think the thing that happens is if you have half the province signing up to get the cheaper rates, then the rates just keep going up for the people who don't, and you penalize them for not giving away their privacy, which is its own issue. But then again, you don't have a right to drive a car. I mean, sometimes you need to, but it gets very complicated. Can we just get to self-driving cars? But in the midst of this, the Liberals and Andrew Wilkinson in particular are very, very critical. I mean, David Eby is still blaming them for leaving it in such a mess. And I think he has another 6-12 months of that at most to get away with. Probably not that long.
Yeah. I mean, not that they won't try for longer, because, you know, Kathleen Wynne was still blaming the Mike Harris government in the 15th year of Liberal reign in Ontario, and well, the Liberals here were doing it to the 90s NDP. You know, you basically can only stop blaming the last government when your government gets defeated, but the public's willingness to go with that always wanes pretty quickly, I think, especially once you're into your second term.
So Wilkinson's big talking point, his big line he's been using is this is a 50-year-old insurance system. It needs a root and branch extraction or something. And he's never said...
He has some weird turns of phrases.
Yeah, I enjoy it. He's never said, I want to fully privatize ICBC, but everything he says kind of leads you right up to that point.
Oh, I think the Liberals are pretty open. They're willing to look at it. It's not a particularly well-kept secret, in the sense that it's not really a secret. And you know, there's a argument you can make on that. Like, some provinces have private insurers, some provinces have public ones. They kind of work well in some and not so in the other. Ontario has terrible private insurance. Just the insurance I had in New Brunswick was private. It was fine. Like it really depends.
It's a very complicated system because no one has a fully private free market insurance system, right? Everyone has at least requirements that you have these basic coverages and your payouts are regulated as well. So whether you have the free market existing within, you know, framework A versus B, and some are public, so you comparing.
So I think like Quebec has like does like both. I think, and like
BC
the public one
does both.
Has like a low enough floor that really forces everyone else to kind of have really competitive rates too. I think like it really depends on the province. So like I think you can honestly make an argument that the ICBC model maybe isn't the best we can do, and you know,
the fact it's losing $1 billion a year is a pretty good sign of that. But
and like the Liberals I think actually might be able to make it work for them as an argument. I don't think it's their best play,
Yeah.
but like I think it's not necessarily a losing one for them either.
Yeah. Comparing insurance regimes across this country is apples and oranges. If the 2 data point trend line of $1.3 billion and then only $890 million is anything to go by, maybe next year it'll only be $500 million in the hole. And by the time the next election rolls around, assuming it's on the regular schedule, ICBC might be breaking even.
Yeah, could be. Also, the Liberals really need to stop doing the NDP had in like the 90s and now, and it's kind of out of whack. Like it doesn't work when you're like less than 2 years out of government. Like it's a bad line. Like the Liberals need to retire that one.
Yeah, when you were the party that covered up the $1 billion in the hole, when you were in cabinet, it gets tough. Come to the table with some solutions and we'll debate them then.
Moving on to a quick follow-up from Nanaimo. All the parties have now figured out who they're running, or at least all the main 3. As the Greens picked Michelle Ney for Nanaimo, as we talked about, 1 or 2 weeks ago now, she seemed like the likely favorite, daughter of a popular former mayor who's immortalized in statue form in Nanaimo, and yeah, I don't think this is a huge surprise. It's going to be a tough one for the Greens to pick up. It's going to be tougher than the Liberals are going to pick up. But like, it's almost certainly going to be an NDP hold, but that doesn't mean all the parties aren't pulling out all the stops on this one.
The NDP actually formally picked their candidate this week as Sheila Malcolmson was acclaimed. For some reason, no one ran against her.
Weird.
I don't think there's word yet if the BC Conservatives have any intention of running in Nanaimo. I think the Libertarians are planning to run someone.
I have heard from the Libertarians that they're planning to run someone.
But we'll keep our eye out for that. There's no official date for the by-election. Nay, for the Greens, didn't feel like a surprise for me. The fact she's the daughter of a former mayor and the other guy was a Vancouverite punk rocker who ran for the BC Conservatives felt weird. But
It's a roundabout way.
Apparently he attracted some support and people thought he was less unusual than expected, but
It's also the Dream Party. They bring in an eclectic bunch.
So we'll have to keep our eye out for when the by-election gets announced in the new year. Moving to Ottawa, Justin Trudeau announced this week that he's got a whole bunch of money for Alberta, or more specifically the oil industry there. $1.6 billion is being thrown at oil companies, those really hard done by, everyone has sympathy for losers these days. On the one hand, Alberta's oil prices are sitting around like $11 a barrel, which is like
bad.
Really bad. The
Like,
best
like
it was 10 times that, and you wanted around 50 to 75 to make your project
you start
profitable.
sweating at 60 if you're in the Alberta oil business.
So this big aid package is to help these companies get more innovative. It's to basically help them invest in new technologies, diversify their markets. And I mean, it's not the most blatant attempt to buy votes ever, I think, but it is a pretty big amount of money.
Yeah.
It's not as big as a pipeline purchase.
No.
This is going to Alberta, who complains about equalization all the fucking time.
Yeah. And like, on one hand, I can kind of see it because people were complaining a few weeks back that, when GM announced they were closing a bunch of plants in like Oshawa and Ontario, there was a criticism that this was treated like a national emergency while oil falling, wasn't. And, that was one of those like Eastern biases that creep into Canadian politics. But at the same time, the Liberals don't have a huge amount to gain from Alberta, despite everything they've thrown at. Like, they have 4 seats there. They're not going to really, I think, gain many more, and nor do I think they're going to be able to save the ones that might fall because of this. So, like, there isn't much political upside to it. And not only that, the Trudeau government, who's made a huge, big deal about climate change, throwing $1 billion and at the oil companies and tacking on like $150 million for some clean tech stuff. It's not a great look for them, and if anything, it maybe hurts them with the marginal Liberal voter more than it helps.
Yeah, for a little specificity in here, most of this bailout is loans, so the government isn't just fully giving away all the money. I guess they will hope to get some of it back. Alongside this, there is an additional $150 million for clean growth and infrastructure projects, which a part of me just goes, why can't we just throw $1.6 billion directly at green tech? Help Alberta build clean tech.
Yeah, like Alberta gets a huge chunk of its electricity from coal and
is actively trying to get off it.
Yeah, like, you could actually help out quite a bit by just giving them $2 billion to build out their electrical grid in a way that doesn't cause the planet to burn.
And across the aisle, the Conservatives, for whatever reason, are not thrilled with this handout. Even the Alberta NDP aren't really cheering it. Conservative Party of Canada is saying they don't want to hand out, which I guess is ideologically consistent for a change.
Yeah, but this is also the same Conservative Party that is completely fine with government handouts as long as it's to the dairy industry or Bombardier, who apparently the NDP are fine with too, but that's another thing. So, like, good, I guess, for the Conservatives to find conservative principle on this, but it's weird that this is the line they've drawn in the sand, especially after criticizing Trudeau for so long about not doing enough to help the oil industry. And, like, I think this is we really want a pipeline. Like,
that's 100% it.
Yeah, can you just build us a pipeline? Which
they legally cannot do.
They're trying to do. They spent $4.5 billion buying a pipeline that they maybe can't legally twin now. And, like, it's just weird that this is the thing that the Conservatives don't like that the government's doing to help Alberta's oil industry. And, like, I don't know, Andrew Scheer's just whatever. Like, he doesn't seem to have a coherent position on, well, pretty much anything.
Well, it's triggered another round of Alberta separatist columns, and we've now seen
that's what we need.
No. Even better is Albexit has been coined, which started a nice thread on Twitter of people making fun of what if each province tried to propose its own separation, and what would the exit pun be? I came up with Brexit Columbia for our own province.
Yeah, that's the obvious one.
That's the obvious one.
But I mean, Quebec separatism was not a great idea, but you could it also wasn't like entirely stupid, but being a landlocked country kind of is a dumb thing to be if you can not be that. And if you don't think the government in Ottawa is going to be helping you get a pipeline to Tidewater now, well, when you're not even part of the country, they certainly aren't going to be doing that.
Well, yeah. It's all frustrating.
That's the tip of the iceberg on why Alberta separatism is stupid.
Yeah. I mean, the natural segue here is, if we're going to talk about conservative stupid responses, this past week, Trudeau has finally started openly musing about breaking the deal we have with Saudi Arabia over these light armored vehicles, which are not jeeps with guns, but rather, they're not tanks, but they're in between there. You know, they got pretty decent guns on them.
Technically, I think they're infantry fighting vehicle. They got armor and big-ass guns. It's basically the long and the short of it.
Andrew Scheer decided he's not for breaking this deal. It would be too onerous on the jobs in southern Ontario, so we should just finger wave at them. Oh, but he has another idea. If we really dislike Saudi Arabia and we're not pleased with them killing journalists and genocidal wars in Yemen and all the other human rights abuses we keep sending them weapons to commit those wars, but instead we stop buying their oil.
That makes no sense.
Well, it goes with the Ezra Levant ethical oil argument. Yeah, we should buy Alberta's oil instead.
At least with Ezra Levant's argument, I can't believe I'm defending Ezra on this one. There was a alternative thing, like it was we shouldn't be stopping our oil industry. You know, it wasn't a great argument, but like you can at least like see the thread there. Whereas with this one, oil's a global commodity. It is substitutable. If we don't buy Saudi Arabia oil, we buy oil from somewhere else, and the people who are buying oil from that place are now buying from Saudi Arabia.
And we end up paying more, probably.
Like it just doesn't help anyone, except it throws a wrench in a bunch of import contracts that the Eastern refineries have.
But even if I take his argument about oil for a moment seriously, why not both? Why not stop sending weapons to Saudi Arabia that they are using to commit these human rights abuses that we don't like, and don't buy their oil? I mean, why not both? So Andrew Scheer's just trying to be contrarian, I guess. I get that's the job title he has, official opposition.
There's the dumb and smart way to be official opposition. And
like Andrew Wilkinson, to his credit, I think is doing a better job. He didn't come out against the Clean BC plan. He said, where's the other 25%?
Yeah.
And got nuanced about it. Andrew Scheer's just like, Trudeau said it, must be wrong.
Pretty much. Yeah, there's some like his NAFTA position is, I would have done it better. That's it. You suck. I would be better. And that's pretty much his position on everything. He's an empty suit without nuance. And that's the big problem with Scheer. Well, one of the many problems with Scheer. Why he's not doing a great job as opposition leader problem with Scheer. There's the dumb conspiracy mongering problem with Andrew Scheer as well. But that's a separate issue.
Yeah, we don't even need to get into that, or I'll just get angry. Finally, since cannabis has been legalized, people have had difficulty obtaining it. Most people have to go to the online stores that each province are running because, like, for example, here in BC, I think we're up to 4 or 5 stores that are open. That's 1 public store in Kamloops, 2 private stores in Kimberley, because...
Good on Kimberley, I guess.
Yeah, I guess their council's the only one who has shit together. And maybe 1 or 2 in the Okanagan. I think like a Soyuz is starting to get up there, but none of the lower mainland is served by a legal cannabis store, and the court actually just shut down a bunch of illegally operating, it turns out, dispensaries. So your only way to get cannabis is to go to the website and buy it. And when you go to that website, you usually have to use your credit card. The problem with that is often those big credit card companies, Visa and MasterCard, might be based in the US, or there might be data breaches. And this actually happened in Ontario, where the Ontario Cannabis Store had a privacy breach where 4,500 people's names got out there. And it's not clear if anyone stole it, but there was an issue. And this doesn't seem like an issue because cannabis is legal. You're allowed to buy it. You're allowed to smoke it. You're allowed to do whatever you want to some extent. Don't drive with it, because those laws changed and got bad. But Canada's Privacy Commissioner has come out and said, you probably still want to keep it a secret as best you can, and that you're smoking or buying, because other countries might not let you in, like the US, because they still consider it very bad. So he's telling people to buy your weed with cash. This is the most... I don't know if it's the most 2018. It's just a very bizarre Canadian...
It's definitely a 2018-esque story.
So there's a full note on the Privacy Commissioner's website, and there's some other simpler recommendations about how to keep yourself, secure. And he's recommending private stores, if they have frequent buyer clubs, just collect as little info as you can and give as little info as you can. And so don't use credit cards, because that might include your name, and then that could get picked up.
Can you actually purchase through this online stores?
No, you have to use a credit card.
Yeah, so if you really want that, cannabis-infused intimate spray, you're going to have to pull out the credit card?
Yeah, it's got to be on Visa. This is in the ongoing realm of legalization, is apparently worse than criminalization.
Who could have known it would be so complicated?
There are going to be many books written about this. Many books. Buy your weed with cash because the Privacy Commissioner told you to. That's all I have to say.
And that has been Politicos. Find links to everything we talked about at politicos.ca. If you are a first-time listener, make sure to subscribe and let us know what you think. Support the show and get access to our exclusive Slack channel at patreon.com/politicos. And if you have ideas for the show, feel free to send to us. Thanks for listening.